A police officer and his wife walked into the shelter, empty-handed, hollow-hearted. They weren't looking for a dog. They were searching for something they had lost. Then, in the last kennel sat an old German shepherd, silent, unmoving. No barking, no tail wag, just a brass tag on his collar that read, "If you found me, someone still believes I matter." What happened next will break your heart and put it back together again. This isn't just a story about a rescue dog. It's a story about a guardian who never stopped protecting, even after he was forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments. And if you believe that every animal deserves a second chance, tap that subscribe button. Because what you're about to hear might just change how you see loyalty, grief, and healing forever. Willow Hollow, Arizona, was the kind of town where winters didn't roar in. They crept quietly across the land, turning yellowed grass brittle and air sharp enough to slice through memory. The sky on that late December morning hung low, colorless, and unmoving. A brittle wind rattled the faded banners left over from the town's Christmas parade, and in the distance, bare trees stood like exhausted sentinels along the edge of the hills. Jake Whitmore drove in silence, hands steady on the wheel as the cruiser rolled past half-empty sidewalks and shuttered shop fronts. At 36, Jake still had the athletic build of a man trained for danger, broad-shouldered with short, dark brown hair beginning to gray at the temples. His gray eyes, once quick to smile, now reflected something quieter, something dulled by loss. He wore his badge in a drawer these days, not on his chest. Ever since the accident that took their son, he'd been on extended leave. Emotional trauma, the paperwork said, as if grief could be measured in memos. Beside him in the passenger seat sat Claire Whitmore, 34, tall and willowy with pale skin and delicate freckled features that had once radiated light. Her ash-blonde hair was tied up in a haphazard knot, and her hands stayed clenched in her lap, white-knuckled and motionless. Claire had been a preschool teacher, the kind that sang to her students and packed handmade notes into their backpacks. Since the accident, she had stopped teaching, stopped singing, stopped believing anything could be repaired. Neither had spoken much during the drive. They didn't need to. Words had become slippery things between them, always leading back to one place, that empty bedroom down the hall. As the car turned onto a gravel road leading to the Cedar Pines Animal Shelter, Claire finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "We don't have to take one home." Jake glanced sideways. "I know." They didn't come here to adopt. They came because they didn't know what else to do. The shelter was a low, squat building made of sun-bleached brick, tucked behind a church and a vacant lot full of tumbleweeds. The parking lot was mostly empty. Inside, the smell of disinfectant mingled with old fur and damp concrete. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a flat white glow on a row of chain-link kennels. A woman stepped out from behind a counter, mop in hand. She was in her 50s, medium height with a stocky frame, chestnut-colored curls, and a red sweatshirt with the faded words "Cedar Pines High" across the front. Her name tag read, Sarah Fenley. "Morning," she said, her tone brisk but not unfriendly. "You folks here for the Saturday tour, or just browsing?" Claire offered a small, tight-lipped smile. "Just looking." Sarah studied them for a beat, then nodded toward the kennels. "They're all clean and current on their shots. Don't let the barking scare you. It's more about nerves than temperament." They walked the narrow aisle slowly, flanked by cages filled with noise. High-pitched barks, anxious yelps, tails slapping metal. Dogs leapt and whirled in circles, desperate to be noticed. Jake barely noticed them. At the far end of the row, the barking thinned. Claire was just about to suggest turning back when Jake stopped. There, in Kennel 16, sat a German shepherd. He was older, maybe 8 or 9. His sable coat streaked with silver along the spine and belly. His ears were worn, one nicked at the edge, and a faint scar ran along his left front leg. One eye was a cloudy gray, the other a deep, unwavering amber. He didn't bark, he didn't move, he just sat in the corner, watching them. Jake crouched slowly, his knees cracking. "Hey there," he murmured. The dog tilted his head slightly. "That one's a strange one," Sarah called out, mopping nearby. "Quiet. Doesn't pace, doesn't whine. Been here 2 months. Ranger found him by the Elk River Bend. No chip, no tags. Only thing he had was this." She stepped closer, keys jingling at her belt, and pointed through the bars at the dog's collar. Jake leaned in and saw it. A worn leather strap, nearly frayed through in places, with a circular brass tag dangling from the center. Jake read the words aloud, softly. "If you found me, someone still believes I matter." Claire froze. Jake looked up at her. Their eyes met for the first time in weeks. The silence between them wasn't empty this time. It was full. Sarah unlocked the gate. The dog stood with slow, deliberate movements and stepped forward, not hurried, but with the dignity of someone who had waited long enough. "What's his name?" Jake asked. Sarah shrugged. "We've just been calling him the old guy. You want to give him one?" Jake looked back at the dog. "Marshall." Claire's breath caught, but she didn't speak. That night, the house felt different. The home on Juniper Lane was modest. 3 bedrooms, sun-bleached paint, a swing that no longer moved on the front porch. Inside, every room still whispered the boy's name. The dinosaur pajamas folded on the couch. The line of hand-drawn stars above the bed frame. His little hoodie, navy blue with a yellow zipper, still tucked in the drawer with the smell of vanilla and milk lingering in the fabric. Claire hadn't touched it in months. That evening, while Jake washed dishes in silence, she went upstairs and opened the drawer, the soft fabric warm in her hands. She held it close, unsure whether to cry or smile. When she turned around, Marshall was lying beneath the drawer, his breath deep and even, as if standing guard over a memory too precious to speak aloud. She sat beside him on the floor. Neither of them made a sound, and somehow that silence felt more like comfort than anything else she'd felt in a very long time. The wind shifted on the second night Marshall was home. Outside, the bare branches of the backyard maple trembled in the still air, casting skeletal shadows across the frosted grass. Inside, the Whitmore house on Juniper Lane remained mostly silent, save for the occasional creak of old wood adjusting to cold. Claire sat at the edge of the living room couch, a blanket wrapped around her knees, her fingers absently tracing the seam of a photo album that remained unopened. The television murmured low in the background, tuned to a weather channel she wasn't watching. Marshall lay a few feet away from her, not on the rug but on the cold wooden floor. His head rested between his paws, his breathing deep, unhurried. He had chosen his place, not as a pet claiming territory, but as a silent presence keeping watch over a grieving home. Jake hadn't said much since dinner. He'd taken his usual walk around the block before returning home, then disappeared into their bedroom. The rhythm of silence had become their normal, interrupted only by the unspoken things both carried like invisible luggage through each room. In the dim kitchen light, Jake stood in front of the open fridge, a glass of water in hand. The chilled air brushed his forearm, but he didn't move. His eyes weren't on the contents of the fridge, but somewhere beyond the white interior, caught in a memory. The sound of tires, a scream, the way the world had tilted on its axis that day. He closed the door. Upstairs, the bedroom window was slightly cracked open, letting in a strip of cold air that cut across the room. Jake lay on his side, eyes wide open, staring at the framed photo of his son on the nightstand. In it, the boy wore that ridiculous dragon hoodie, mouth open in a laugh so full it felt alive. Sleep came in snatches now, and when it did, it came broken. That night, the dream returned. Glass, screeching tires, a flash of yellow, Jake running, his own voice echoing, calling out for his son, knowing, somehow already knowing, that he wouldn't reach him in time. He jolted upright in bed, soaked in sweat, lungs dragging in air like someone drowning. And there, standing beside him, not moving, was Marshall. The old shepherd's eyes, one cloudy and one sharp, met his in the dark. Marshall didn't whine or nudge. He simply stood as if waiting, anchoring the moment so Jake wouldn't float away in panic. His ears twitched once, the only sign he'd noticed the change in Jake's breathing. Then, slowly, the dog stepped back and lay down at the base of the bed, resting his head on his paws again, never once breaking eye contact until Jake finally exhaled. That was the first night in months Jake didn't get up to check if the front door was locked 3 times. The next morning, Claire noticed something different. Marshall had moved closer to the window where the boy's drawing still hung, one of those childish masterpieces where stick figures smile beneath a crooked sun. He sat there quietly, as if studying it. When Claire entered with a mug of tea, he turned to glance at her, just once, then returned his gaze to the crayon-colored world taped to the glass. Claire found herself saying out loud, "He used to call you Marshall, you know, before we ever met you." Marshall didn't react, but he didn't have to. Later that afternoon, Jake returned home earlier than expected. He still wore the blue jeans and dark thermal he used for off-duty days, his hair wind-tossed from riding with the window down. He placed his keys in the tray by the door, then walked straight to the coat rack where his holster hung. Old habit. He didn't wear it often anymore, but he kept the weapon loaded, just in case. Not because he feared someone breaking in, not really. It was more about the feeling that danger, or loss, or whatever haunted him that year could still creep back in through unseen cracks. Jake turned toward the hallway, only to stop short. Marshall stood there, stiff-backed, ears alert. In his mouth was the holstered gun, not biting, not growling, just holding it gently in his jaws like a message. Jake froze. Marshall walked over, paused in front of the coffee table, then lowered the gun onto the floor with surprising gentleness. With a small push of his nose, he nudged it under the table's wooden edge, out of reach. Then he stepped back and looked up. The message was clear. Jake blinked. "You really are something else." It was the first time Jake had spoken to him like that, not as a dog, but as someone who understood. And maybe he did. That night, the air in the house was still cold, but the silence felt different. Less suffocating, more like rest. Claire pulled the old hoodie out again. This time she didn't cry when she touched it. She simply folded it neatly and placed it in a box labeled Keep. Marshall watched from the doorway. Jake sat at the edge of the bed staring down at his empty hands. Then, with a slow movement, he opened the drawer beside him and took out the badge he hadn't worn in over a year. He didn't pin it on, he just held it. Marshall walked in and sat at his feet, and Jake finally reached out to place a hand gently on the old shepherd's head. The desert wind had sharpened by sundown. It blew through the narrow streets of Willow Hollow like a restless spirit, lifting dust along the curbs and rattling loose shutters on quiet houses. The town was still in that post-holiday lull where decorations lingered long after joy had faded, like ghosts that hadn't yet realized they were no longer welcome. Street lamps hummed overhead, their amber glow dim and flickering. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote cried out, lonely and too early for the hour. Jake Whitmore pulled his collar up against the wind as he walked the sidewalk along Maple Avenue. His boots crunched over scattered gravel, one hand tucked in his coat pocket, the other loosely gripping the end of Marshall's leash. The old German shepherd walked at his side, head low, ears relaxed, but eyes moving constantly. It had been 3 weeks since they'd brought him home, and Jake was still surprised at how natural the routine had become. Marshall didn't pull, didn't lag, didn't bark at passing cars. He simply walked, quiet as moonlight, every step in sync with Jake's pace. Jake hadn't planned to patrol, not officially. He wasn't back on duty, but since the nightmares had eased, since Marshall began sleeping near the foot of his bed, he found himself walking the old beat again. Not out of obligation, but for something else. Familiarity, maybe. Control. At the intersection of Elm and Grant, Jake slowed. The corner was dimly lit, the streetlight overhead flickering between life and death. The sidewalk ahead disappeared into shadow. Marshall paused beside him, his body suddenly still. Jake felt it too. Across the street, hunched behind the mailbox of a foreclosed property, was a figure, male, mid-20s, twitchy posture, hood up. Jake squinted and took a few steps closer. "Evening," he called, keeping his voice neutral. The man looked up. His pupils were pinpricks, his jaw clenched tight. He stepped out from the shadow with a jerky motion, revealing a thin, pale face covered in cold sweat and a split scab near his mouth. One hand held a blade, long and narrow, gleaming under the dying light. Jake's instincts screamed, but his body stayed still. The man stepped forward. "Don't move, just your wallet." Jake didn't flinch. He didn't speak, but his muscles tightened, ready. Then Marshall moved. Not with noise, not with warning. Just a blur of tan and black fur lunging forward. The leash taut in an instant. The shepherd collided with the man's arm, teeth clamping the wrist holding the blade. The man shouted in shock, stumbling backward. The knife clattered to the ground. Jake moved fast, pinning the man with a swift takedown maneuver he hadn't used in a year. The stranger thrashed once, then gave up, panting beneath the weight of muscle and fury. It was over in seconds. Jake snapped the cuffs around the man's wrists and sat him against the curb, breathing heavily. Marshall stood nearby, not panting, not triumphant, just still, watching, waiting. Jake looked at him with disbelief. "You've done this before, haven't you?" he whispered. "You were trained." Marshall didn't react, but his eyes stayed sharp, focused. Jake crouched and placed a hand on his neck just behind the ears. "Thank you," he said. It wasn't the first time he'd said it in his life, but it was the first time he meant it without question. A patrol unit arrived 15 minutes later. Officer Dylan Reyes, a young Hispanic cop in his late 20s with an easy grin and a badge that still shined like he polished it daily, stepped out of the cruiser and raised an eyebrow. "Didn't think you were back on duty, Whitmore." Jake shrugged. "I'm not." Dylan glanced down at the restrained suspect. "And yet, here we are." As they loaded the man into the back seat, Dylan nodded toward Marshall. "That your dog?" Jake looked down. "Yeah, that's Marshall." "Looks like he's more than just a pet." Jake nodded, but his eyes stayed on the dog. "Yeah, he is." Meanwhile, back on Juniper Lane, Claire parked her car in front of a little corner shop with faded yellow awnings and a chalkboard sign out front that read, "Hot Pastries and Healing Hearts." The bell above the door jingled softly as she stepped inside. The smell hit her first. Cinnamon, butter, sugar, and something warmer, older. A scent that clung to memory like melted wax. She hadn't stepped foot in Eleanor's bakery since the birthday. The shop hadn't changed. Checkerboard tiles on the floor, wooden shelves with cracked glass cake domes, and a hand-painted mural of a smiling boy holding a cherry pie. At the counter stood Eleanor Faulkner, mid-60s, silver hair pulled into a high bun with a red bandana, eyes sharp behind thick glasses, and a plump figure wrapped in an apron that read, "Powered by Pastry." Eleanor had a brisk, no-nonsense manner, a habit formed from 40 years of working ovens before dawn and losing a son in the Navy. Her voice was matter-of-fact, but her actions were always kind. She had known Claire since she was a teenager. "Well," Eleanor said, drying her hands on a dish towel, "either you're here for a tart, or you're finally forgiving me for the dry lemon scones of 2019. Claire smiled, genuinely, for the first time that day. "I was just passing by." Eleanor narrowed her eyes. "No one just passes by grief, honey. Sit. I'll make tea." While Eleanor bustled behind the counter, Claire glanced toward the photo board by the door. Customers had pinned old pictures there over the years. Birthday parties, community fairs, lost pets. And there, in the bottom right corner, was a blurry photo of an ambulance scene. Paramedics, lights, people gathered. And in the foreground, a German shepherd, standing perfectly still beside the open ambulance door. Claire leaned in. Eleanor returned with 2 mugs of tea and followed her gaze. "That was from the Highway 12 wreck," she said. "Last year. Little girl was hit by a drunk driver. That dog showed up out of nowhere, stood by her side until they loaded her in. Never saw anything like it." Claire's voice caught. "You sure that was him?" Eleanor squinted. "Looked just like the one you posted a photo of yesterday. The eyes especially. Like he's listening to something the rest of us can't hear." Claire stared at the image a long moment. Later that evening, when Jake returned home, Claire was already waiting in the living room, the photo from the bakery in her hand. She said only one thing: "I think he was meant to find us." Sunday morning brought a rare calm to Willow Hollow. The sky was pale blue and stretched like an old bedsheet over the roofs of town, and the air was still enough to carry the scent of juniper and firewood from chimneys. Jake sat at the small table by the kitchen window, sunlight spilling over his hands as he turned the brass name tag slowly between his fingers. He'd cleaned it the night before, wiping away grime and time until the engraving was clear. "If you found me, someone still believes I matter." But just beneath that line, nearly hidden along the edge, was a faint, scratched address. 144 Cedar Hollow. He tapped it gently against the table. Claire, standing by the sink with her hair tucked behind one ear and her coffee cooling beside her, leaned in. "Is that an address?" "Looks like it," Jake said, "just outside of town. You want to go?" Jake nodded. "I think we should." Marshall, who had been resting at the foot of the table, lifted his head. His ears twitched at the word "go," but there was no excitement in his reaction, only calm attention, as if he somehow knew this trip had nothing to do with fetch or fields. Cedar Hollow wasn't marked on most maps anymore. It used to be a small stretch of homes tucked into the hills north of Willow Hollow, where the trees grew thicker and cabins were older than most of the roads. The drive took them along winding turns, past mailboxes painted by hand, and fences mended with mismatched boards. At the edge of a pine-lined gravel lane, they found it. 144 Cedar Hollow. The house was a one-story cabin built from dark timber and stone, with ivy curling around the porch railings and smoke rising faintly from the chimney. A carved wooden sign hung above the door, weathered by decades of sun and snow. On the porch sat a man in a worn flannel shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, reading a faded paperback with yellowed pages. When he looked up, his gaze was steady but not unkind. Raymond Clark was in his late 60s, tall and thin with a spine that had begun to stoop but not break. His silver hair was combed back neatly, and a small scar ran from his right eyebrow to the edge of his cheekbone. An old injury, perhaps from his years on the force. His eyes were a smoky blue-gray, deep-set and sharp, and his movements had the slow precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime thinking before acting. Jake stepped forward. "Mr. Clark? Raymond?" Raymond stood, marking his page with a receipt. "That's me." Jake gestured toward Marshall, who stood quietly behind them. "We think this dog might have belonged to someone connected to you." Raymond's gaze shifted and froze. For a moment, the years seemed to drop away from his expression. He stepped forward slowly. Marshall didn't move. His tail didn't wag, but his posture shifted, more alert, more aware. When Raymond reached them, the old shepherd took one step closer and looked up at the man, eyes steady. "God," Raymond whispered, voice gravelly with memory. "Juno." Claire blinked. "Juno?" "That's what we called him," Raymond said, crouching slowly, his knees cracking. "Short for Jupiter. Emma picked the name." Claire and Jake exchanged a glance. Raymond rose and motioned toward the porch. "Come in, I'll explain." Inside, the cabin smelled of cedarwood, lemon oil, and something older, like time had folded itself into the walls. The furniture was simple: a couch patched at the corners, a rocking chair near the fireplace, and bookshelves crammed with paperbacks and old field manuals. A few framed photos hung on the wall, faded snapshots of a younger Raymond in uniform, smiling beside a girl in a wheelchair with a riot of curly blonde hair and a defiant grin. "That's Emma," Raymond said, noticing Claire's gaze. "My granddaughter." He sat heavily into the rocker, his knees stiff. Emma had leukemia, diagnosed at 9. The fight went on until she was 13, and she never stopped smiling, even when it hurt. Raymond pointed at Marshall. "She begged for a dog. I didn't want to. I knew where things were heading, but the doctor said a therapy dog might help. So I pulled some strings at the precinct, and we found Juno. He wasn't retired yet, just in between units, but even then, he was something else." Claire sat down gently on the edge of the couch. He protected her? More than that, Raymond said. He gave her peace. She used to read to him every night. Said he listened better than people. Jake glanced down at Marshall, who now lay by the fireplace, head resting on crossed paws. He hadn't made a sound since they arrived. His eyes watched Raymond, not warily, not with longing, but with an old familiarity that held no bitterness. Raymond rose, went into the back room, and returned holding a small tin box wrapped in a green ribbon. "After she passed," he said, voice quieter now, "I couldn't bring myself to send him back to the shelter. I couldn't keep him either. My hands were shaking too much back then, my heart worse, so I let him go, with a note." He handed the box to Claire. Inside were a handful of handwritten letters on notebook paper, decorated in colored pen. Claire read one aloud. "Dear Juno, if I'm not here someday, I want you to find someone sad and help them not be. You're not just my dog. You're someone's hero. Love, Emma." Claire pressed the paper to her chest, blinking fast. Raymond looked away. Jake stood quietly and crossed the room to where Marshall lay. He crouched, ran a hand down the shepherd's back, and whispered, "You didn't lose her. You just carried her forward." They left an hour later, the tin box on Claire's lap. Raymond stood at the porch, one hand resting on the railing, his gaze steady as they pulled away. Marshall looked back only once. The Community Wellness Center in Willow Hollow stood behind the town's old library, tucked under a canopy of bare-limbed oaks and surrounded by a cracked parking lot where faded hopscotch patterns still clung to the pavement. The building itself was a modest, two-story brick structure with a wooden ramp on one side and a large picture window out front where someone had painted a mural of wildflowers and stars. On a cold Tuesday morning, Claire stepped inside with Marshall at her side and Jake close behind, both wrapped in coats and the cautious optimism that something small, anything, might bring healing to someone else the way it had started to for them. The lobby smelled faintly of crayons and lemon-scented cleaner. Behind the check-in desk sat Helen Griggs, a middle-aged woman with short auburn hair, thick glasses, and a smile that looked practiced more out of habit than joy. Helen was known around town for her steadiness. She'd worked at the center for nearly 20 years, ever since losing her husband in a construction accident. Since then, she'd found comfort in structure, in laminated schedules and labeled folders. "You must be the Whitmores," she said, glancing over her bifocals. "This must be Marshall." Claire smiled softly. "Yes, he's a quiet one." Helen leaned forward, peering at the old shepherd. "That's good. Some of these kids need quiet more than noise." Marshall didn't react, didn't wag, didn't fidget. He simply stood, ears relaxed, tail low, gaze watchful. Helen pointed down the hallway. "You'll be in the reading room. That's where we do the read-to-a-listener sessions. The kids don't like pressure. Dogs don't judge stutters or silence." Jake nodded. "Sounds like the right audience for him." The reading room was warm and softly lit, with floor cushions scattered across a rug shaped like a giant tree. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with everything from picture books to middle-grade fiction with creased covers. Claire took a seat on a low bench while Jake unhooked Marshall's leash, letting him settle wherever he liked. Marshall walked slowly to the middle of the rug and lay down, front legs outstretched, head lifted just enough to scan the room. Within minutes, the door creaked open, and 3 children walked in. One boy with bright red headphones and his head down, a girl with mismatched socks and a nervous glance, and trailing behind them, Ava, a thin girl of about 8 with long straight brown hair and a turtleneck 2 sizes too big. She moved as if the air resisted her steps. Her eyes flicked toward Marshall but didn't linger. She sat on the edge of the rug without choosing a book. Helen entered and gave Claire a quiet nod. "Ava's new. Severe anxiety. Barely speaks. She's been through, well, more than most." Jake sat near the back watching Marshall. The dog's ears flicked once, but he didn't move. The session began. One child read a few pages aloud, stumbling over words and laughing it off. Another gave up halfway and started flipping pictures instead. Ava sat silent the whole time, hugging her knees. Then, as the other children were being led out by a volunteer, Ava stayed behind. Helen didn't interrupt. She knew better. Claire knelt beside the girl, speaking gently. "Would you like to stay with Marshall a little longer?" Ava nodded slowly. Claire handed her a picture book, its corners soft from use. Ava took it, hesitated, then scooted closer to Marshall, who still lay in the same position, silent, still, waiting. She opened the book. Her lips moved. Nothing came out. She tried again, this time a whisper, a single word, then another. Her voice trembled, cracked, but it grew, slowly, like something long buried pushing toward light. Jake leaned forward. Ava's voice rose, just enough to form sentences. By the third page, she wasn't reading to Marshall, she was reading with him. Marshall hadn't moved at all, except that his head now rested lightly against Ava's knee. She smiled once. Just once. But it lit the whole room. Later, while Ava was taken home by her caseworker, Claire wiped her eyes quietly. "Did you see that?" she whispered to Jake. "I did." Jake carried a small black notebook in his jacket pocket now, his old duty log, repurposed. When they got home, he sat at the kitchen table and flipped open the cover. He hadn't written in it since before the accident. The pages still held the scent of old ink and spilled coffee. He turned to a blank page and wrote, January 12th. Today, a little girl found her voice again. She gave it to Marshall like a secret, and he didn't break it. He just held it, and gave it back to her safely. He paused, tapped his pen once, then added another line. First time in a year, I didn't wake up from a nightmare. I woke up because Marshall nudged my arm. Just once. Gentle. He knew it was time to breathe again. From across the room, Claire watched him write. Marshall lay beneath the table, eyes closed, tail twitching faintly in sleep. The quiet had returned to their home, but this time it felt alive. It began with a photograph. Just one, pinned to the hallway wall near the staircase with a small brass tack. It was a picture Claire had taken at the community center. A quiet, overexposed image of Ava sitting cross-legged with a book in her lap. Marshall curled at her feet. There was something about the symmetry of it, the stillness. It didn't demand attention, but it refused to be ignored. Jake passed the photo on his way to the kitchen that morning, coffee in hand, and paused longer than he expected. Later that day, he added another, a Polaroid taken at the Wellness Center's open house, showing Marshall lying in the center of a ring of children. Each child had a book open, but most were simply watching the dog, their little faces soft with wonder. By week's end, the photos became a pattern. They cleared the space near the staircase, just above the baseboard heater, and Jake repainted the wall a soft slate gray. Claire brought home pushpins, yarn, and a bundle of photo frames she found at a thrift store. They called it the Wall of Marshall. The wall grew slowly. One photo was of a teenage boy named Devin, caught mid-laugh while Marshall lay beside him at the youth center. Devin had once struggled with drug dependency and had been in and out of juvenile court. But since volunteering to walk Marshall on Wednesdays, he'd stayed clean for 92 days. Another image showed Mrs. Dolores Meyer, a retired librarian with silver hair like spun steel and a voice like crumpled paper. She'd recently lost her husband of 53 years. Marshall had laid his head on her lap during her first grief support meeting. She'd cried for the first time since the funeral. Jake didn't narrate the wall, he just let it speak in silence. One evening, as the winter wind picked up outside and the trees scraped soft warnings against the window panes, Claire curled on the couch with a blanket and a worn poetry book. Jake sat nearby, flipping through his notebook, the pages now filled with small, neat entries, dates, names, moments. Marshall lay beneath the table as always, a steady presence. Claire looked up from her book. "Did you ever think a dog could be this much of a thread?" Jake glanced up. "Thread?" She nodded, holding things together even when they look like they're falling apart. He considered it. Maybe he doesn't tie the pieces together. Maybe he just reminds us the pieces are still worth keeping. They were quiet after that, but the silence no longer felt like absence. That same week, Claire returned from the grocery store one evening while Jake was still at the community center. It was close to 7 p.m., and the streetlights had just flickered on outside their home on Juniper Lane. She pulled into the driveway and grabbed 2 paper bags from the passenger seat. The porch light was on, casting a weak glow across the frost-speckled lawn. As she approached the front door, a figure stepped out from behind a tree. Claire froze. The man was in his mid-30s, hoodie pulled low, hands tucked into his coat. He held a clipboard in one hand and a brown paper bag in the other. "Delivery," he said flatly. "Wrong address, maybe. You, Claire?" Claire tightened her grip on the grocery bag. "Who's it from?" The man stepped forward. "Didn't say." Before she could respond, a low, resonant growl echoed from inside the house. Claire looked through the narrow glass panel beside the front door and saw Marshall, standing squarely in the center of the hallway, hackles raised, teeth bared but controlled. His body was tense but unmoving, his eyes locked onto the stranger with eerie precision. The man hesitated, took a step back. Then Marshall lunged. Not at the door, but toward the glass, just enough to slam his front paws against it with a thud that rattled the frame. The growl became a full, guttural bark. The man dropped the clipboard, turned, and bolted down the porch steps. Claire, breath caught in her throat, quickly unlocked the door and stepped inside, groceries forgotten. Marshall remained at the window, still watching, but didn't give chase. When Jake returned minutes later, Claire had already called the sheriff's line and reviewed the footage on their front porch camera. The video showed everything: Marshall's reaction, the man's retreat. The door never opened. Jake uploaded the footage to the department system and, at Claire's request, shared a copy on the Neighborhood Watch page. The video went viral overnight. Within 24 hours, local outlets picked it up. Dog defends woman from home intruder. Then, the Guardian with silent eyes. Within a week, Marshall's image was on posters at the community center and on a banner across the animal shelter's website. At first, Jake wasn't sure what to make of the attention, but the more he watched Marshall remain unchanged, unmoved by cameras or applause, the more he realized the dog didn't need recognition. He simply needed to be allowed to keep doing what he did best. That night, after everything had quieted again, Jake added one more photo to the wall of Marshall. It was a still from the footage. Marshall at the window, teeth bared, light catching the brass tag at his neck. Underneath it, Claire wrote a single word in chalk on the frame: Protector. Snow had arrived in Willow Hollow with a kind of grace that felt rehearsed, soft, deliberate, and quiet. By mid-morning, the rooftops wore smooth white crowns, and the maple branches outside the community center shimmered like lace under the sunlight. Children dragged sleds through the park while parents clutched thermoses and pointed at icicles with nostalgic reverence. The annual Winter Festival was the town's way of saying thank you to itself. This year, the stage had changed, just slightly. Jake stood beneath a canvas awning at the edge of the town square, the toes of his boots buried in powdery snow. He wore his formal dress coat, dark navy with silver trim, the badge polished so bright it caught the light every time he moved. Claire stood beside him in a long cream coat that fell gently over her curves, subtle now, just beginning to show. She kept one gloved hand resting against her stomach. Marshall sat between them, not leashed, not restrained, just present. The MC for the ceremony was Marcia Keene, a retired drama teacher in her early 70s who wore oversized scarves like battle sashes and spoke with a voice meant for stages, not microphones. She stood on the wooden platform with her trademark poise, tall, straight-backed, with a cascade of white curls pinned under a knit beret. Though she had no children of her own, Marcia had long ago adopted the town itself, guiding its talent shows, memorials, and civic rituals like a benevolent general. "This year," she said, her voice carrying through the hush of snow and anticipation, "our final recognition is not for a show dog, not for tricks, not for obedience, but for presence." She let the word settle. There is a dog in this town who does not perform. He does not entertain. He does not seek attention. But everywhere he goes, people find something they didn't know they were missing. Marcia gestured to the side of the stage. "Jake Whitmore, would you join us?" Jake stepped forward, the snow crunching underfoot. Marshall rose with him, walking at his side like a shadow made flesh. "And Marshall," Marcia added with a smile, "the dog who listens." The applause was not thunderous. It was soft, respectful, like the town had learned to mirror the dog it had come to love. Jake stepped up and turned back to lift Marshall onto the low stage platform. The old shepherd moved slowly, but with steady dignity, as if the boards beneath him were familiar ground. Marcia handed Jake a small plaque carved from cedar and brass. It read, "Civilian Canine of the Year, for healing without command, for presence without noise, for reminding us what stillness can do." The moment passed in the sound of mittened claps and the gentle swirl of snowflakes. Then, from the back of the audience, an elderly man stepped forward with the cautious balance of someone living with brittle bones. He wore a thick wool coat, the collar turned up, and a flat cap pulled low over wispy white hair. His hands trembled slightly as he approached the stage steps. Claire recognized him immediately. Walter Grady, a former mail carrier who'd delivered to their street for decades. He had outlived 2 wives and most of his neighbors. Cancer had taken his brother last spring, and the diagnosis had arrived for him not long after. Marcia stepped aside as Walter climbed the stairs with slow determination. He stopped in front of Marshall and knelt with effort. "I never told anyone," Walter began, his voice rough but clear. "When the doctor told me what was coming, I sat in the rec hall that afternoon, trying not to fall apart. This dog walked in with the Whitmores, laid his head right on my shoe and didn't move. Not for 15 minutes, not a sound." Walter swallowed hard. "For the first time in months, I didn't feel alone." He reached out a gnarled hand and gently stroked Marshall's head. "Thank you," he said. There were no cheers, no speeches after that, only the kind of quiet that felt like prayer. Claire stepped closer as the photographer raised her camera. Miriam Cole, a petite, energetic woman in her late 30s with curly black hair and a camera that had documented everything from baby showers to barn fires, crouched to get the shot. She had a keen eye for timing and a mother's patience for silence. Claire rested her hand on her belly and leaned slightly toward Marshall. That was when it happened. Marshall turned his head and placed it gently, deliberately, on Claire's stomach. Miriam didn't miss it. The shutter clicked once. The image, once printed, showed Claire in soft profile, one hand over her belly, the other in Jake's. Marshall's head pressed gently to her coat, his eyes half closed, a picture of loyalty and gentleness. That photograph was framed and hung in the lobby of the community center a week later. Underneath, in elegant script, was written, "Protecting the past, welcoming the future." At home that night, Jake taped a copy of the same photo to the wall of Marshall. He didn't write anything beneath it. He didn't need to. The first warmth of spring arrived quietly in Willow Hollow, carried on the scent of thawing earth and the slow unraveling of frost from window edges. The maple tree in the Whitmore's backyard had begun to stir, its branches whispering with newborn buds, catching golden light in their tips. The morning sun poured gently through the kitchen window, warming the hardwood floor where Marshall had made his morning spot, just as he always had. Jake stood by the counter, coffee in hand, his body wrapped in quiet routine. He glanced at the window, expecting to hear the soft tap of claws across the floor, the familiar thud of Marshall settling near the back door, but there was only silence. He frowned, stepped into the hallway and called, "Marshall?" No sound. Jake moved toward the living room, his boots soft against the rug. That was when he saw him, lying beneath the wide window where the sun always touched down first. Marshall's head was tilted slightly, one ear forward, one paw crossed over the other. From a distance, it looked like he had simply fallen into a nap. Jake knelt slowly, already knowing. Marshall's body was still warm. The sunlight glowed against his coat, now faded at the edges, his eyes closed as if caught mid-blink. There was no tension in his limbs, no fear or pain. Only stillness, the kind that whispered peace. Jake placed a hand on his chest and bowed his head. He didn't cry at first. He just breathed and let the silence surround them. When Claire came into the room, her hand instinctively moved to her stomach, now clearly round beneath her dress. She didn't speak. She sat beside Jake, and together they rested their hands on the old shepherd's fur. "He waited," she whispered. Jake nodded. He knew. They wrapped Marshall in the soft, navy-blue blanket that once belonged to their son. The edges were frayed, the fabric faded, but it still carried the scent of something sweet and innocent, like safety, long gone, but never forgotten. Jake carried Marshall through the yard, his steps slow but sure. Claire followed, her arm linked in his. They buried him beneath the old maple tree, the same one Marshall had laid beside every afternoon, watching the wind move through its leaves like he was guarding something too sacred to speak aloud. Jake had carved a small headstone from smooth, pale stone. The same brass tag that had once hung from Marshall's collar was now pressed into the center. It read, "If you found me, someone still believes I matter, and now, so do they." The ground was soft, the earth willing. Claire placed a single pine cone on top of the mound, one their son had once collected on a walk with Marshall. Jake laid a stick, nothing grand, just one Marshall had favored, and then stepped back. The yard was quiet, but not empty. A week later, Jake visited the elementary school. He wore his full uniform for the first time in nearly 2 years, the fabric stiff but familiar. His boots clicked against the linoleum floor of Willow Hollow Elementary, past posters about kindness and literacy, and a mural that featured a forest of animals holding books. He carried a manila envelope under his arm. Inside the principal's office sat Mrs. Ruth Brenner, a woman in her mid-60s with short silver curls, a cardigan dotted with embroidery, and glasses that hung from a red cord around her neck. Her desk was covered in files, 3 coffee mugs, and a row of hand-painted figurines of woodland creatures. Mrs. Brenner had been principal for more than 20 years. She had taught Claire as a girl and remembered Jake as the quiet boy who once stopped a fight by sitting down between the combatants and refusing to move. She welcomed Jake with a kind smile, motioned for him to sit, and took the envelope. "What's this?" Jake looked down at his hands. "It's a collection of notes, journal entries, about Marshall, what he did, who he helped." Mrs. Brenner opened the envelope, scanned the first page. Her expression softened. This is beautiful." "I don't want it to be just mine," Jake said. "I think kids should read it. Know that healing isn't always loud. Sometimes it just shows up, waits." She nodded. "I know exactly what to do." Within a month, 20 small booklets titled The Dog Who Listened were printed and distributed to classrooms as part of a program called Reading with Empathy. The book featured short vignettes. Ava, reading her first full sentence, Mr. Grady's story on stage, Marshall's silent protection of Claire, and even Devon's transformation. Each story ended with a reflection prompt. How can we be like Marshall today? Some children drew pictures of dogs with superhero capes. Others wrote letters addressed to the silent guardian. But one day, a second-grade teacher found a boy named Elliot sitting beneath the maple tree behind the school, right beside a small wooden replica of Marshall's grave built by the woodshop class. Elliot was 8, thin and small for his age, with shaggy blonde hair and a habit of avoiding eye contact. He didn't speak much and often chose to sit at the edge of every group, arms around his knees. That day he held a copy of The Dog Who Listened in his lap. When the teacher approached and asked, "What's your favorite part?" Elliot looked up slowly. His voice was soft, but certain. "He didn't bark," Elliot said, "but he heard everything I didn't know how to say. Sometimes a dog doesn't just find a home. He becomes the quiet thread that sews hearts back together." Marshall was never loud. He didn't perform tricks or chase spotlights, but in his silence he heard grief, held space for sorrow, and offered comfort in the most human of ways. He reminded a grieving couple how to breathe again. He stood by the weak, the lonely, the forgotten, and in doing so, reminded us that healing doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it comes wrapped in fur, with tired eyes and steady paws. In our busy lives, we often miss the quiet miracles happening around us. But what if the next miracle isn't loud? What if it's waiting outside a shelter, behind tired eyes, just asking for a chance? If this story touched you, share it with someone who believes in second chances. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your heart. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one. May God bless all of you who still believe that even the quietest among us can carry the greatest light.
The chickens had stopped clucking. A silence had fallen across the eastern edge of the farm, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that presses into the skin. Not even the wind moved the tall, brittle stalks along the dried fence line. Just the steady creak of the gate as it hung half-open, swaying like something had slipped through. Harlan didn't notice at first. He was too focused on the rust-flecked handle of the feed bin, cursing under his breath as it caught again. His left boot had split near the sole, and the earth was damp where it shouldn't have been. Morning sun slanted low across the pasture, but it wasn't warm. It hadn't been for days. Then the dog growled, low, guttural, almost beneath hearing. Harlan turned slowly, his hand halfway between the feed scoop and the .22 rifle that leaned against the back wall of the shed. He didn't move fast. His spine did that thing it always did when something was wrong before his brain caught up, locked still. Like a post jammed into the earth. There, just beyond the garden beds, behind the collapsed water trough, stood a dog. Its coat was soaked in places, dry in others, thick with burrs and ash dust. Not a wild dog, not entirely, but there was nothing tame about it either. A German shepherd, older than it should have survived out here, ribs showing just under the fur. Its front leg trembled, not from fear, but exhaustion, and its eyes, they weren't wide with threat. They were locked on him, not the way animals look at men. The way someone looks at someone. Harlan's fingers twitched toward the rifle. The growl deepened, but the dog didn't move. It didn't bare teeth, didn't lower its head, just stared like it knew what the man was thinking before the thought was finished. That stare, it unnerved him more than any snarl would have. He stepped forward. "Go on," he muttered, voice dry. "Go back where you came from. Ain't nothing for you here." The dog didn't flinch. Behind it, a single hen darted from the coop's shadow, flapping noisily, but the shepherd didn't chase, didn't even glance. That's what made Harlan hesitate. He'd chased off plenty of strays over the years, some desperate, some mean, some so gone in the head they didn't know fear. But none had acted like this. None had waited. He took another step. The rifle was still out of reach, but the bolt cutters weren't. Rusted steel, dulled at the tips. They'd do in a pinch if the dog charged, but the shepherd lowered itself instead, its trembling leg folding underneath with the care of something that had done it too many times. And there, behind it, half covered in weeds and barely upright, was a splintered collar post, nothing else. No leash, no bedding, just a cracked blue tag that flashed once in the light. Harlan blinked. That tag, the shape, the way it caught light, the way painted metal did, not plastic. It was old, and he'd seen it before. No, he knew he'd seen it before. His chest tightened, not with panic, but something worse, that slow creeping feeling when a memory walks backward through your mind, knocking pictures off the wall as it comes. 12 years back, winter colder than usual. His boy, young then, had brought home a pup wrapped in a fertilizer sack, frost on its whiskers and pads, worn bloody from God knows where. Named it Tabor, named it like he'd named a brother. The pup had vanished. 7 years later, just before the rains, they'd searched for 2 days. Harlan hadn't let himself hope past the third. Coyotes, he told his son, or the river. Life out here didn't explain itself twice, but now he was staring at a ghost that hadn't aged right. A dog with the same scar under the eye, the same dark freckle on the foreleg, and a blue tag bent now with 3 faded letters etched into the curve. TBR. His throat tightened. His knees felt wrong. He hadn't said that name in 5 years. Still, the dog didn't come forward, didn't wag, didn't whimper, didn't so much as tilt its head. It just waited. Not for affection, for permission, for something behind them. The sun finally lifted above the trees, and with it, a sound, a low thump, distant but distinct, like something heavy dragging over wood. Harlan turned his head slightly toward the barn. The dog's eyes followed. Silence stretched between them, the kind that comes before things change, the kind that only old animals and old men know how to sit inside. And as the wind stirred for the first time all morning, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke and something else, something metallic and bitter, Harlan took a breath and stepped forward. The dog rose, slow, careful, favoring the back leg. Not toward him but toward the barn, where no one had been in 2 weeks, where no reason should be for a dog to return unless it had left something behind. unless it knew something waited. Harlan didn't reach for the rifle, didn't speak again, he just followed. And the dog, pausing once at the threshold of the barn's long shadow, looked back, not for approval, not for safety, but to see if he was finally ready to understand what it had come to show. The floor of the barn was darker than it should have been, not the soft gloom of dust and old wood, but a heavier kind of dark where the shadows didn't quite settle and the light from the open door barely touched the corners. Harlan hesitated just past the threshold, boots creaking against the boards. The air inside was still dense with the smell of old straw, rusted tools, and something else, something that didn't belong. Metal, faintly sweet, almost like blood, but older, faint. The shepherd moved first. Tabor, if that's who this was, stepped forward with practiced caution, not sniffing, not tracking, but heading somewhere he already knew. He paused only once, beside the old hay bins, ears flicking toward the back stalls. Harlan squinted in the same direction, but all he saw was a rusted plow and the old tack shelf. Everything else was still then. Something shifted in the far corner, a whisper of movement low to the ground. Not a rat, not a possum, a drag, followed by breath. Harlan tensed. The shepherd didn't. He walked on, circled slowly toward the back, where the floor dipped slightly near the broken trough. His nose lowered once, not quite touching the ground. Then he looked up. At the same moment, a shape pulled itself into view, barely. A second dog, smaller, thin as a memory, tucked between 2 feed crates. Its flank rose and fell in slow, shuddering rhythm. A torn rope hung loose around its neck, half frayed, the fibers damp with spit and dirt. One paw was curled under, unmoving. The other scraped slightly when it breathed. It didn't raise its. The head didn't flinch. It had given up that kind of effort. Harlan's breath caught, not from fear, from recognition. That rope, it was the same cord he'd used once to secure the old fence gate. The same cord his neighbor Joel used now for the pups he bred in town. But Joel hadn't been out here in months. The shepherd sat down beside the smaller dog, careful not to touch it. He didn't lick, didn't paw, just watched it, patient and alert, like a soldier keeping vigil at a post no one remembered assigning. The smaller dog wheezed once, then stilled. In the quiet, the barn seemed to draw breath again. Something creaked above, the sound of a bird startled from the rafters, but Harlan didn't move. He looked down at the shepherd. "You brought it here," he murmured. The dog blinked once. Not affirmation, not denial, just acknowledgement. A thick silence settled, the kind that demanded something be done, not later, not thoughtfully, but now. Harlan moved toward the crates. The floor gave slightly beneath his weight. He crouched slowly, his knees stiff with years of labor and unforgiveness. The pup didn't react. Its eyes remained half-lidded, its ribs too sharp. It had been carried here. That much was clear. By him. By Tabor. That was the only way it could have reached this place. Across the ravine, under the fencing, through the scorched field and broken pasture, a journey not meant for young legs, and certainly not for a dog that couldn't walk. And suddenly, the shepherd's silence made sense. He hadn't come back to be found. He had come back because he had no choice. Harlan ran a rough hand over his chin. The stubble caught at his fingertips. He hadn't shaved in 2 days, hadn't meant to. A low roll of thunder trembled across the hills. He looked toward the barn door. The sky had darkened subtly, but meaningfully. Clouds swelling with distance, moving too fast for the time of year. The dry heat was changing, and with it, everything under its spell. Behind him the pup shuddered again. A sound escaped its throat, weak, high-pitched, not a whimper. A request. Harlan stood. He turned back to the dog who wasn't supposed to return. Tabor's gaze hadn't moved. His body was taut now, not aggressive, protective. But something in his eyes had shifted, a flicker of doubt, not toward Harlan, toward himself, that as if the strength that had carried the pup here might not last much longer. Outside, the wind kicked up dry leaves from the edge of the paddock. Dust spiraled, casting a faint golden haze across the barn's doorway. For a moment, it looked like something burning, not fire, but memory. Then it passed. Harlan stepped forward. He knelt between them, not reaching for the injured pup, not yet, but lowering himself to their level, letting the air move around them, letting the decision settle. And then, quietly, the shepherd laid down this time. His muzzle rested lightly across the pup's shoulder. No command, no warning. Just wait. Presence, endurance. And Harlan finally reached out his hand, not to take, but to listen. That's when he saw it tucked under the pup's foreleg, half hidden in matted fur. A folded scrap of paper, wound tightly in a piece of cloth, torn at the edges. Damp, but still legible. He didn't open it, not yet, but everything, the storm, the silence, the journey now pointed toward one simple fact. This wasn't just rescue. This was a message, and someone had gone to great lengths to make sure it was delivered. The barn door creaked wider before he touched it, just a fraction, enough to stir the dust from the threshold, enough to send a sliver of sunlight crawling in like it wasn't sure it belonged. The shepherd moved first, not with confidence, but with practiced memory. She didn't sniff or hesitate. She stepped forward like she'd been here before, but not recently, and not under good circumstances. Harlan kept his distance. His boots crunched over the grit and rat droppings that had settled during the long months the place had sat unused. The hayloft above sagged slightly, ropes frayed at the knots. An old bucket rested at an angle near the trough, still stained with the minerals they used back when the calves had trouble feeding. Everything smelled of thyme and dried wood. Not rot, but not life either. She paused beside the stall that used to hold the injured stock. The wall was still marked with teeth lines from a calf that hadn't made it one spring. The dog's nose twitched, but she didn't enter instead. She backed up deliberately and looked at the floorboards near the rear corner of the barn. Harlan followed her gaze. There, just at the seam where light met shadow, was a dark patch in the boards. At first he thought it was old oil. Then he noticed the way it hadn't dried at the edges, and the buzzing faint, but there somewhere nearby, beyond the wall. He bent slowly, knees cracking. The smell reached him now, not fresh, not decayed, either like something caught between stages. A low whine cut through the barn, not from her dot from beyond. Harlan looked at her dot. The shepherd had dropped into a half-crouch, not to hide, not to lunge, but as if something in her body had remembered a command she no longer trusted to obey. She wanted him to see. That much was clear. He stood, careful, and moved around the back of the store. A tarp, blue, warped from sun and mold, was pinned beneath an old sack of lime. With effort, he pulled it aside. Beneath it, in the narrow crawl between the barn and the root cellar wall, something shifted. Two eyes blinked back at him. A pup, no older than a few weeks, mottled coat, half-starved, curled against an empty paint bucket. It didn't make a sound, didn't rush forward or retreat, just stared. The way animals do when they're past fear and into something else entirely, waiting. The mother didn't move. Not a sound, not a step. She just waited, tense, as if her bones remembered what happened the last time she'd left him hidden like this. Harlan exhaled slowly, the ache in his chest, not from exertion, not quite. He didn't reach in, not yet. He looked at her again. "Where have you been?" he muttered, voice more breath than word. She sat down, finally. Her back leg shook once and then stilled. Her tongue lolled slightly, mouth dry, and for a moment everything in the barn seemed to settle. The dust stopped rising. The air thickened, soft and still, until the pup made a sound, a short, rasping cough. Harlan blinked. That wasn't just hunger, it was the kind of cough you heard in the winter, when the animals slept too close to the DAMP walls, when the frost bit just enough to settle in the lungs. Slow, quiet, and cruel. His fingers twitched again. Not toward a weapon, toward memory. He turned on his heel, walked back to the shed, returned minutes later with a blanket and one of the old syringes they'd used on the goats. He hadn't touched this kid in years. The shepherd didn't interfere when he bent down. The pup didn't resist, just let itself be lifted, curled tighter in his palm than any living thing ought to. She stood then, not to follow, but to step between him and the light, casting a long shadow over both. She didn't look at the pup. She looked at Harlan Dart, and he understood. This wasn't a rescue, this was a HANDOFF. She had brought him here to do what she couldn't, what she might not survive long enough to attempt again. Outside, the wind picked up, lifting the hanging wires on the fence line just enough to make them whistle that same hollow tone you heard before storms came in from the hills. When he turned back, the shepherd was limping toward the edge of the pasture, not quickly, but with intent, the same way she had arrived, as though this wasn't her home anymore, as though she'd only returned for one thing. He called out once, just her name, quiet, unsure. She paused, looked back, then kept walking, and that's when he noticed something odd in her gait. Not just the limp, something bound near her flank, a torn strip of faded denim, tied in a makeshift knot, stained at the edge, from a shirt he hadn't seen since last spring. The one his son used to wear. The barn door creaked open with a groan that didn't belong to wood alone. It carried something older, heavier. Harlan paused just before the threshold, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. The air inside was stale and warm, thick with the scent of dry straw, rusted tools, and something else, something faintly sweet and sour, like time left unchecked. The shepherd didn't hesitate. She slipped into the shadow without a sound, her paw pads silent on the packed earth, but her steps careful, deliberate. Harlan watched her weave through the half-collapsed fencing rails and toppled feed bins, pausing once near an overturned wheelbarrow. Her ears twitched toward the far corner, the part of the barn where the rafters still held, where the light from the hole in the roof made a single gold beam across the dirt floor. And that's when he heard it, a click, faint and hollow, like claws on concrete. Not hers, something else. He stepped inside. The temperature dropped by degrees, not from wind, but from memory. It had been his father's barn before him, and before that, a lean-to cattle shelter that hadn't held cattle in decades. No one's walked this end since the roof sagged, but now it felt occupied. The shepherd stopped at the corner post, her body low, not in fear, in deference. Her head dropped slightly, tail still, chest barely rising. She wasn't guarding anything, she was presenting it. In the shadows he made out the shape. It took a moment for his mind to catch up. A smaller dog, half-curled but alert, one paw extended as if mid-step. Its coat was patchy, not with mange but with sap and burrs, as if it had been pulled through the bramble and didn't resist. Its eyes blinked slowly at him. Young, maybe 6 months. But it wasn't the pup that stole his breath. It was what the pup was lying on. An old feed blanket, blue and gray, with stitched corners he remembered from nearly a decade ago. The same one his boy used to wrap Tabor in when storms came. We hadn't seen that blanket since the day they burned the last of the calf pens out back. How had it gotten here? The pup shifted, and something clinked faintly beneath it, a loop of metal. He crouched, not daring to get closer yet. The shepherd didn't stop him. Her eye stayed on the pup. There was no blood, no visible wounds, but the tension in the pup's belly was unmistakable. Shallow breath, ribs lifting too fast, tail twitching once, then going still. A scent lingered now that he couldn't ignore, engine oil, mixed with heat. Not from this barn. From outside he looked at the dog. She was watching the door, and outside, somewhere just beyond the field, an engine coughed to life. Not a tractor, too smooth. A truck, idling low. Then birds startled in the distance. Not a flock, just a scatter. As if something had walked through a hedgerow where no man should have been. Harlan's jaw tightened. He rose slowly, but not without stiffness. The shepherd stepped back just enough to let him pass. He moved toward the door again, careful to stay in the shadow line, his boots quiet. The road was empty, but tire marks fresh, deeply scored into the mud, arced down from the slope near the broken fence. They hadn't been there yesterday. And there, at the edge of the grass, a smudge of rust-colored wool, sheep's wool, torn. But Harlan didn't keep sheep. He followed the trail with his eyes. It disappeared into the thicker underbrush, and just before the next bend, a fragment of tarp flapped lazily from a thorn bush. He exhaled through his nose, a sound like something old escaping. Someone had been here, and they'd left fast, but not before something or someone followed them back. When he turned, the shepherd was sitting at the doorway. Her gaze met his again, calm but unreadable, not demanding, waiting. Behind her, the pup let out a short breath, not a whimper, but the kind of sound that comes after a body has stopped bracing for pain. And somewhere, deep in the grass beyond the barn, the wind moved again, but not across the whole field, just in one direction. A tunnel of movement that made the trees to the east stiffen. Not a breeze, a presence. Harlan didn't know what kind of trouble he'd stepped into, but he no longer doubted who had led him here, or why. The dog hadn't returned because she needed something. She'd returned because she remembered something. And whatever had followed her, whatever she had taken, it wasn't finished. He stepped back into the barn, gently shutting the door until it latched with a soft click. Inside, the light was shifting now, dimming as if the world outside was holding its breath. And as the shepherd settled beside the pup, laying her head between her paws, Harlan did something he hadn't done in years. He reached out, slow, weathered, hand brushing the old blanket, and waited, too. The light inside the barn had grown thin, the kind that makes dust hang like old breath between beams. The shepherd shifted once beside the pup, her body curled just enough to shelter but not smother. Her eyes had closed, but her ears remained alert, twitching slightly with every soft groan of the settling structure. Harlan stood near the wall, hat in hand, staring at the shapes they made, the old, the new, the near lost. A scent of cedar and old hay drifted from the rafters. The wind outside had stilled completely, as if the air was waiting. He bent down, quietly now, knees cracking without shame, and placed the metal water bowl at arm's length from the blanket. It had been his son's idea, once water first, not food. Trust wasn't built on meat, it was built on patience. He didn't touch the pup, didn't try to coax, he just waited, hands on his thighs, breath shallow. The pup didn't move, but its ear flicked toward the sound of the bowl. A good sign. Not submission, but recognition. A signal that it still measured the world instead of surrendering to it.